Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements workshop meeting. My name is Brenda Crona. On behalf of the Stakeholder Affairs Group, we welcome you to today's meeting. Today, we have our ISO staff, as well as Michael, who will be helping out deliver a few slides today. We'll go into formal introductions later on, but today let's go ahead and kick off this call, as we do have some housekeeping reminders to go over. This call is being recorded and will be posted for informational and communications purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We are adding this as a workshop, so we are adding this during the working group session, so we appreciate this possibly engagement of opportunities to share different perspectives, and also allow Michael and James to go over a few topics for today's call. So we do encourage to keep comments brief, professional, and respectful. If there's any questions that need offline, we could definitely talk to you later on, but we definitely want to be cautious of our timing for this meeting. And then we do have an ISO commenting templates available for the previous working group. And then if there's any verbal or written agreements you would like to provide, feel free to send them over through the chat and add your affiliation as well. We do have our event producer, Ahmed, who's here to help us with the technical aspect of this meeting, but if you do have any questions, let us know. We did change our call me feature back to this WebEx call. We apologize from this morning meeting. We did have some technical issues from the entire organization that was giving us a link. They canceled a meeting, and then they fixed it up right away. So hopefully everyone was able to see that email right before this call and able to join now. So I do see about 75 folks who were able to successfully join us, and thanks so much for those who did send us a chat that the original pre-registration link was not working, and that's correct. So we fixed, the entire group did fix that for us. To ask a question during this call, just use the raise hand icon located on the lower toolbar. That will allow us to know who's on queue. We do encourage you to also use the #2 if you're only logged in through the phone line. I'll double check with Amhand if there's any people that are logged in, but at this time I don't see anyone who's logged in through audio only. But also when you're asking a question, please state your full name and affiliation so we know who's speaking and able to address the question back to you. And then if you are asking a question, if you do have a response to wait from our panelist group, make sure you don't mute yourself so we can be sure that if you have something to say back, you're unmuted during that time of that question and comment. At this time, I'll go ahead and introduce a few folks. I do see Juan on video, and he'll help us kick off this workshop for today. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks, Brenda, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning here for a Monday morning workshop. So I just want to really briefly kind of cover a couple of points here for the purpose of this workshop and what we mean by the difference between a workshop and a working group session. We're going to be joined by our lead policy developer, James Friedrich, and then Michael Convolator here, who are really going to be doing the lion's share of today. What we're hoping to do today is really educate about the different methods used to incorporate commitment costs into price, as well as kind of that comparative analysis, exploring other methods that are used in other markets that we heard from stakeholders. So when we say, please let us know what kind of information would be useful or beneficial for you to kind of continue our discussions and make sure that we have a deep and solid understanding of a topic to continue the discussions with the working group sessions. This is precisely our response to that. So very happy here to have both Michael and James. Let's go ahead and kick it off. We're going to have quite a bit of information presented. We'd like to keep that open Q&A. So James is going to pause and really kind of call for some questions as he kind of goes through the presentation that he's developed. So raise your hand or hit #2. Again, we do appreciate the engaged conversation, so I will reiterate what Brenda just said. Don't unmute don't remute yourself, right? So we can have that back and forth. So James, I will hand the floor off to you. Thank you.
All right, Juan, thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. Today, as Juan teed up, we're going to be talking about a specific topic within the umbrella of fast start pricing that we thought could use a little bit more airtime and discussion, given the previous discussion we had on fast start pricing on December 12th, where the CAISO presented its draft results for analyzing potential market impacts of fast start pricing, which is the sort of the part of the phase of this fast start pricing initiative that we're working on right now. And part of that analysis included two different ways of amortizing commitment costs into prices. And those methods involve some math, and we felt like it might be beneficial before the final analysis comes out sometime in March to reflect on those methods and walk through them a little slower and more deliberately than we could on the 12th, and allow stakeholders more time to ask questions and really understand what's going on there. As well as we want to sort of paint a picture of the different methods that are being used across different markets, and so have a little bit of discussion at the end about a separate method that's used outside of the one that we're considering in the analysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. I just want to plug that I'm joined by Mike Cadwalader, who, as you know, if you've been following the Price Formation Enhancements initiative, Mike is a consultant helping us with fast start pricing. And so Mike has a lot of experience implementation of fast start pricing, especially in the New York ISO. So Mike will be providing some color commentary today and help me answer any questions that you might have. So feel free to field questions to both Mike and to myself. We'll both be available to help. And Mike may have some more broader expertise in what other markets are doing on certain topics. So we'll certainly lean on him if needed. So, okay. So one last thing I want to mention before we get started. So again, the purpose of this material is educational. And it's not so much yet, at least, a policy level discussion. And so the slides don't attempt to really get into discussion about nitty-gritty comparisons between, in terms of like the benefits and the trade-offs between methods. We do that a little bit, but we don't get into it as much as we plan to, when we begin more policy level discussions on fast start pricing. So just keep that in mind, that the intention today is just to be educational, and that we will have more opportunity later in the year to talk about specific details about trade-offs between the methods. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so a very quick refresher on fast start pricing, just in case you've been following or need a quick refresher after the weekend. Fast start pricing, there are many different methods across markets to incorporate fast start pricing. Fast start pricing is not a one-size-fits-all market design, but the basic intention is to, and this is a quote from the FERC NOPR on fast start pricing back in 2016, to quote, recognize that fast start resources are the marginal resource used to meet the next increment of energy or operating reserve demand. And fast start pricing is not only attempts to recognize these resources are next marginal unit, but has two different features to try to incorporate or better incorporate fast start resource costs into the marginal price of the market. And those two features are, one, to relax the minimum output constraint in the pricing run, and that's necessary for block-loaded fast start resources or fast start resources that have minimum operating levels that are sort of blocky and need that constraint to be relaxed in order to set the price. But really the focus of today's discussion is all about the second feature, which is then to include commitment costs in the price calculation. So that's what today's focus is. So that's one of the facets of fast start pricing that we'll be taking a deeper dive in today. Let's go to the next slide. So at a high level, fast start pricing separates the function of the scheduling run and the pricing run, and you find the interventions of fast start pricing really only in the pricing run of the market. So just a reminder, most ISOs, including the CAISO, have a scheduling run and a pricing run that solves the market with different intentions in mind. The scheduling run does not make any, there are no changes in resource parameters as a result of fast start pricing in the CAISO scheduling run or in any ISO scheduling run, which is essentially to establish the dispatch points and does not determine prices in markets. And so the scheduling run uses scheduling priorities to solve the market and is used to find out the optimal schedules for resources and optimal unit commitment for resources. And then there's a separate run called the pricing run, in which fast start pricing does change some of the resource parameters as mentioned on the last slide, both to relax the minimum output constraint of the resource, but also to somehow amortize or incorporate fixed costs into the price. And the pricing run essentially is what determines the prices in the market. And so again, fast start pricing, the methods used in fast start pricing show up only in the pricing run, so that the optimal schedules are still determined using the resource's actual parameters to make sure you don't provide infeasible schedules, but it's just the calculation of the LMPs and the prices that are used with some different assumptions about the resource parameters that help yield fast start pricing. Next slide, please. So the first question is, why does fast start pricing incorporate commitment costs into the locational margin price? And these bullets sort of get back to the FERC NOPR as well, and sort of take some notes from there. One is that the market can commit fast start resources in real time, close to when they're needed to serve load, and running an optimal dispatch or 10-minute basis, as most markets do. If you have fast start resources that are able to start up and meet load very quickly to the time that you need them, that's sort of a flexibility benefit that the fast start resources provide. And consequently, as in bullet 2 states, the market incurs the cost of committing these resources around the same time as the market incurs the incremental energy costs of the resource. And therefore, fast start pricing logic suggests that including the commitment cost in the LMP would more accurately reflect the cost of serving load, because you're incurring those costs around the same time. And so that's the basic logic underlying fast start pricing, and why you would fast start pricing logic includes incorporation of commitment costs into locational marginal price. So it's not just about as we saw on slide maybe 5 or 6, that you're going to relax the minimum output constraint, which better allows for blocky units to set the price by allowing them to be marginal. But you have this additional feature of incorporating commitment costs into the LMP for the reasons stated here. By the way, in terms of Q&A, feel free to raise your hand at any time or press #2 at any time if you have a question or comment. I'll be pausing at the end of each slide and monitoring the hands in the queue to see if there are any hands, and if there are, we'll take a pause at the end of each section. Okay, so now that we've discussed why does it matter to incorporate commitment costs in LMP for fast start pricing logic, we can get into sort of the bulk of the conversation today, which is how is that done? And so the basic of it is that fast start pricing integrates commitment costs into the variable bid range. And the variable bid range is essentially a term to say the range of output that varies with price that the generator offers into the market. So this essentially includes its flexible resource or its flexible range. And in fast start pricing, remember that fast start pricing also, because it has the minimum output relaxation characteristic, essentially that it makes units that have blocks of capacity below their Pmin flexible as if they were completely flexible from zero output to their Pmax. And so one of the features of fast start pricing is to assume that in the pricing run, these block loaded units are completely flexible and have a variable bid range. And so the LMPs will include these commitment costs essentially into the variable bid range of the unit. And there's really at a high level, there's two common methods for this integration of commitment costs. One, which is most of our focus today, is by using modified offer curves. And modified offer curves would be familiar if you followed the December 12th discussion, because that's essentially the method with which the CAISO is analyzing fast start pricing. At a high level, modified offer curve methodology is used by New York, ISO New England, and an SPP, although the New York method differs substantially from the ISO New England and SPP method, which we'll talk about today. And then there's also this concept of integer relaxation that's used in the PJM and also used in the MISO under their ELMP methodology, which we'll talk briefly about at the end. But essentially, these are two different mathematical formulations that can get you the same pricing outcomes. It's just a matter of implementation detail to really discuss the difference between these two. And I do want to mention that, or I mentioned that these sort of methods are covering the 5 markets that have fast start pricing. But I do want to provide an important disclaimer that the modified offer curve and the integer relaxation approach will be discussed in today's workshop at a high level and are not intended to include every detail from other market designs. We did exercise our diligence to ensure that you take full responsibility for any misrepresentations of other market designs. So we did a survey with the other ISOs, important details about how they're integrating commitment costs, but we're not attempting to, in today's discussion, provide every detail about how this is done, but it's sufficient enough to get a comparison done at a high level. I also want to add before we move on that CAISO does have this concept of constrained output generators, or COGS. That is a feature in our market. And the methodology for incorporating or allowing constrained output generators in the CAISO to set price utilizes a modified offer curve methodology for pricing. So, and to the extent that CAISO's existing market design would allow for some sort of fast start pricing like features, the way that it's implemented and defined in our tariff already includes the modified offer curve type methodology. So just a small point there. Any questions or comments on this slide before we move on? Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the rest of the conversation is going to be structured around the previous slide that had broken down the fast start pricing mechanism into either using modified offer curves or the integer relaxation method. And so the majority of the rest of our slides are going to cover the modified offer curve approach. And so that's how it will be structured. We're going to see the modified offer curve approach broken up into 3 different variations, and we'll go through some examples of all 3 and reasons why you might have these variants between these methods. But the high level principle here is that essentially, under the modified offer curve approach, the market is adding some sort of amortized commitment cost to a resource's incremental cost before solving. And so there's some sort of fixed costs that need to be amortized, or amortized meaning is to divide or spread out costs over some period or some range, that you essentially take a resource's incremental bid curve and add some value to it in the pricing run. And so we'll see some demonstrations of that in the next couple slides. Commitment costs in this case sort of incorporate 3 different types of costs, but only 2 of which we'll be discussing in today's slides. So that'd be startup costs, or the cost that a unit incurs from being committed, and it is a one-time cost. Minimum load cost, which is a $1 per hour value that incorporates the cost of a resource operating at its minimum output. And transition costs, which at the December 12th discussion, we did get into a little bit, that in the CAISO's analysis of fast start pricing, we are incorporating MSG resource, or multi-stage generator resource transitions, as a eligible commitment cost to be included in fast start pricing, provided that the transition time between configurations is sufficient to meet the definition of fast start. And so just to simplify the discussion today, we're not going to talk about transition costs, but do know that in the CAISO's analysis, transition costs are included, and the concepts would be very similar to what we're discussing for the other 2 types of costs. So again, we're going to explore 3 different variations today, and let's pause here to see if there's any questions or comments before we move on. Okay, next slide, please.
I think we're good to go, James.
All right, thanks. So we're going to talk about the method of basically taking an incremental offer curve, which are provided in units of $ per megawatt hour. So these are the offer curves that resources are offering on their variable bid range. And in order to construct a modified offer curve, you need to get convert the startup cost and minimum load cost into $ per megawatt hour units. Because remember, the modified offer curve basically takes the incremental offer curve and adds some value to it that is used in the pricing run. And so because startup costs are in units of dollars and minimum load costs are in units of $ per hour, we have to make some adjustments to those costs, or amortize them is another way of thinking them, to make sure that they're in $ per megawatt hour units so that you can add it to the incremental offer curve. Next slide, please. So let's start with startup costs. We're going to amortize startup costs over the resource's maximum output and minimum uptime. And so here is the equation that we used in the December 12th discussion on fast start pricing. And what we're going to do is we're going to break this down sort of step by step. The first thing I want to mention before we sort of break down this equation and talk about what each of the terms mean is that there are variations to the ways you can amortize startup costs. So in this case, and for the CAISO's analysis, we're going to be amortizing startup costs over the minimum uptime. Minimum uptime basically means the amount of time, the minimum amount of time that a resource needs to be online before receiving a decommitment instruction. And so that's the period of time with which we'll be amortizing startup costs and to incorporate for fast start pricing. But there are alternatives to that, which is not the intention of today's discussion necessarily, but we can revisit the question of the specifics of how to amortize these costs when we develop any sort of fast start pricing proposal or have a policy discussion on that. Okay, I see a question before we go to the next slide, so let's take the first question.
Good morning, James. This is JQ Wang from PG&E. Just a quickly clarification. I see the notation saying the market interval FFM equals to 15 minutes. Are we discussing in the context of the fast start pricing only being implemented in real-time market?
For today's discussion, yes, and that's a good clarification that because the analysis that CAISO is working on that was presented on December 12th is using FMM as the market to determine the impacts of fast start pricing. In today's discussion, the relevant market intervals will be 15 minutes in length because that's the FMM dispatch time.
And in the greater context, since you mentioned this is a review for different markets, will you provide some insights, like for different approach? What are the markets being applied?
So one way of thinking about it is startup cost. In this context, startup costs are amortized over the minimum uptime, and I guess one obvious alternative is that you could amortize startup costs over the entire time that a resource is operating, which if you're thinking about in the day ahead market, that's pretty easy to do because you have a 24-hour time horizon with which you can amortize, and you know how long the resource is going to be online from that period. You can still do it that way in the real-time market, even though the resource may not be online or the real-time market look ahead may not be sufficient to cover the entire time the resource is online, but you can still sort of play with those different ways of doing it. And my impression is that if I'm not mistaken, for startup costs, I'd have to go back and check if other markets are amortizing startup costs over minimum uptime. I know for minimum load costs, they do not do that. But I think some markets do keep the startup costs over the minimum uptime, but not all of them. I think there's a mix.
Yeah, James, if Mike Cadwallader here, if I could just interject, another way to do this is to instead of doing it over a minimum uptime or how long the resource is operating or expected to operate. Another way to do it is essentially to try to assess, so why was this resource committed? Why was it started? You might incur substantial startup costs or minimum load costs for a resource that's going to run for an hour, but you really need it for the next 15 minutes. You really would have plenty of resources available for the last 45 minutes that it's running to complete its minimum uptime. So it's really getting started for the next 15 minutes. And so the concept there would be, well, let's go ahead and amortize commitment cost over a 15-minute period as opposed to amortizing it over the hour. And so you could do that. In theory, you could actually do calculations based upon the look ahead to assess how likely it is to start that unit. Now that's likely to be fairly, that takes time. And so that might be more difficult to do, in which case you could do what New York is doing, and they've basically done some analysis, on the side and assessed that most of the time 15 minutes seems to provide most units like this that are started to meet load in real time, it's usually to meet load the next 15 minutes. And so they basically kind of fixed that parameter. So that's not going to be the correct number all the time, but they figured it's close enough, approximately the correct.
Thanks, Mike. That's really helpful. So you're saying it is possible to anticipate a need for the running time of this fast start unit and to incorporate that into this formulation.
Yeah, I don't know that I exactly said that. I mean, I think it might be. I'm going to refer to the CAISO with respect to that, but I mean, I know that in theory one could do that. You could take a look at the look ahead and say that, gee, this unit is being dispatched to meet load in the next 15 minutes. I think you could do something like that, but I don't know that anybody is actually doing that. Like I said, New York probably gave it some consideration and decided to do something simpler. That is based upon what results you would get if you were doing something like that.
In that case, will this be defined by the resource or by the ISOs?
So the parameters with which this equation come up would be defined by the ISO.
Okay, so the anticipation will also be set up by the ISOs. That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Of course, the parameters themselves would all be sort of master file resource specific parameters, but the actual equation and method for amortizing would be consistent for all resources set up by the ISO. Okay, any other questions or comments? Thanks, JK.
James, yeah, we have one in the chat. Is delta T determined by the base schedule or after actual operation?
So delta T is kind of, well, let's get into the, I have sort of a breakdown of each specific term. Let's see if that breakdown helps answer the question, and if it doesn't, we'll come back to it. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is sort of take each of these terms. It's not a simple equation to sort of think through. So what we're going to try to do is think of this step by step here. And so the most intuitive way for me to think about this is that if you're amortizing over the minimum uptime, you first want to determine how many time intervals, which is delta T, fit into the minimum uptime, which is MUT on the slide. So in this case, because we're thinking about this in context of the CAISO's FMM market, which is a 15-minute granular market, since change of T or delta T is 15 minutes in this case, if the minimum uptime is, say, 1 hour, which is 60 minutes, that would be 4 intervals. And so in this case, if the resource had a 1 hour minimum uptime, then that term there, MUT over delta T, populates as 4. And so that's how that would be calculated. And then I want to note that there's this operator that has these vertical lines with a small little hitch on the upper side, which indicates a term called a ceiling function. And the ceiling function essentially just means that you're rounding up to the nearest whole number. So to the extent that the term MUT divided by delta T gets you some sort of fraction, you're going to round up to the nearest whole number. And that can be easy to think about. Think about a resource with a minimum uptime of, say, 10 minutes, and the delta T is 15 minutes. You essentially don't want to be amortizing over fractions of an interval, because then because you need to have fixed quantities of intervals in order to amortize these costs. And so this term does need to be a whole number, and so you'd be rounding up in that case. Okay, let's get through all of these, and then I'll pause for questions. So then let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now that you've determined your value for the minimum uptime divided by delta T, you then have a max function here to ensure that you always consider at least one time interval, even if the minimum uptime is less than delta T. So in this case, if for some reason that term resulted in a value of 0 or some sort of fraction, that you would always make sure that you have at least one interval with which to amortize the cost from. But to the extent that you have more intervals than just one to amortize costs over, the second term of the max function will take value. Next slide, please. Okay, so then you have the number, after you've done the max function, you know the number of intervals with which you need to amortize costs over, but now you need to multiply this number by a few things in order to get it into the right units. So first you need to multiply the number by the resource's Pmax and scale it to an hourly rate by dividing by 60, since change of T is given in minutes and there's 60 minutes in an hour. And so basically what this does is it gets you into, you know how many intervals you need to amortize over, but now you need to get this term or the denominator into sort of megawatt hour units. And so that's where you would divide by the Pmax of the resource. And so you're allocating costs over the entire output of the unit, and you have the right time interval by scaling it to an hourly rate by dividing by 60 there. Okay, let's peek at the next slide to see if that adds on to this. Okay, so I guess I'll just do this quick example and then we'll pause to see if anybody wants to have a question or comment from the last 4 slides. So here's a simple example, and these are similar numbers as were found in the December 12th analysis. So if you were ever to review that analysis, you would be able to follow it maybe a little closer. But say you had a resource with a Pmax or an output of 450 megawatts. It incurs a $2,000 startup cost anytime it's committed, and it has a 1-hour minimum uptime. Then you take the equation on the left that we walked through, and you add in all of the inputs. You have a $2,000 cost in the numerator. The max function is populated using the minimum uptime and change of t, which essentially becomes the value of 4. You have 450 megawatts for its Pmax, and then change of t divided by 60 essentially takes that value and divides it by 4. So in this case, what we want to point out here is that because the minimum uptime happens to be 1 hour, then the effect of or converting this term at the end, 15 minutes divided by 60, sort of cancels out because it's already in hour form. But you could imagine that if the max function, let's say the minimum uptime of this resource was 30 minutes, and so you're only amortizing over 2 intervals, then you would have then this sort of this last term, 15 minutes divided by 60, actually makes a meaningful difference because you're not in sort of hourly units yet. You're in 30 units of 30 minutes. So if you were to do the arithmetic of this, equation on the right, you would find a value of $4.44 per megawatt hour. So that's a simple example of how specifically startup costs are amortized. And basically, if you were in a world where you were only amortizing startup costs, for this specific resource, you would take this $4.44 per megawatt hour, and you would add that value to the resource's incremental energy bid in the pricing run, and that becomes sort of your fast start pricing adder in this case. Okay, so let's pause and reflect on slides 13 through 16, and if there's any questions or comments, feel free to ask. Okay, so that was a simple example to amortize startup cost. And so let's move to the next slide. So now we're going to talk about minimum load costs. So minimum load costs are the other sort of fixed or commitment costs that we're trying to amortize and incorporate into the resources bid curve. So actually, yeah, let's make sure. So JR just raised their hand and they had a question in the chat that maybe wasn't answered. So let's go back to slide 16 and take JR's question.
This, but it looks like the denominator essentially is always going to be the Pmax unless the delta T is greater than 60, in which case then it's just Pmax times delta T over 60. I don't see the reason for the max one of 60 over 15, because if it's the max, if the function evaluates to the max of MUT over delta T, that gets offset by the delta T over 60.
So one way it could differ, say the minimum uptime of this unit was 15 minutes instead of 60 minutes, then you want to be amortizing costs over one 15-minute interval, but you need to get that into dollars per hour. And so what would happen is MUT over delta T would take a value of 1, which would be 15 minutes divided by 15 minutes. And then when you multiply it by the term at the end, 15 minutes divided by 60, you've essentially taken the hourly fixed cost and converted it into sort of a 15-minute cost over a 15-minute scale. So it still does help, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I'm saying, is that the max function evaluates to 1. Anytime the max function doesn't evaluate to 1, the other number offsets it to essentially 1.
So in this case, I'm not sure I follow. So in this case, the max function.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I do see what you're saying. Yeah. If it was.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. If the minimum uptime was, say, 40 minutes or 80 minutes, right? Yeah. Then it wouldn't get offset by the second, or by the 15 delta T over 60. It wouldn't get offset. Okay. Never mind. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah. So you got it there. So then the last term. So one thing to note in the context of this, the last term is always the same. 15 minutes divided by 60 is just the because in this case we're assuming we're amortizing costs in the FMN, so that 15 minutes divided by 60 would be the same regardless of the minimum uptime, and so that is just to make sure that we have the right units at the end. Okay, great. I'm glad we answered that question. Okay, any other questions on the slides 13 through 16, the amortization of the startup costs? Okay, so let's move on to, okay, one more question. Okay.
Thanks. This is Adam Cornelius with Snohomish PUD. So it's just, I think I'm following this, and just to test my understanding, in this example, that $4.44 would be added kind of only to the period of the minimum uptime, not if the resource was on for a longer period, then that would kind of drop off.
In this case, yes, but those underlying assumptions, there are variations to that, of course.
Right, but in this example, it'd just be for the period of the minimum uptime, effectively.
Yeah, and to summarize your comment for the audience, essentially what you're saying is that only for the 60-minute period with which you're within your minimum uptime does this $4.44 adder show up on top of your bid, in fact, for the fast start pricing portion. So yeah, that's the right assumption.
Okay, thanks.
You got it. Okay. So I'm just reading. I'm reading a question in the chat. Maybe I'll read out loud and see if I can provide an answer. Are we able to provide any kind of summary statistics like minimums, average, maximums on the inputs to this equation, like startup costs, minimum uptimes, delta T? So in this case, delta T would always be constant, because delta T is going to take, really, if you're doing FMM, it's going to be delta T will be 15 minutes. If you're an RTD, delta T will be 5 minutes. If you're in day-ahead market, delta T will be 60 minutes. So that'll always be a factor of which market you're solving in. And in terms of summary statistics for startup costs, minimum uptimes for units, we can take that back and consider that, as long as it's aggregated over it's aggregated over a sufficient quantity of resources. That may be something that we can provide. Because something that is interesting in the data is different technology types have really different sort of characteristics and magnitudes of startup and startup costs and minimum load costs and things like that. So that could be something we can consider. And then Robert has a question in the queue. I can't hear Robert. If you're speaking, I can't hear you.
You may be double muted here. Fair enough. Yeah, why don't you go ahead? Let's call back in and re-raise your hand, and we'll come back to you.
Sorry about that, Robert. Okay. So for the time being, let's move to slide 17, and we'll come back to Robert's question when he comes. We'll call us back in. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to undertake this bid for startup costs. Now we're going to talk about minimum load costs, which is easier to do because minimum load costs, the minimum load costs, closer in nature to that of the incremental curve. All we really have to do is divide the minimum load cost by the Pmax of the resource, and you're going to get the right units. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, by dividing the minimum load cost by the generator's Pmax, you get the cost per megawatt hour or dollar per megawatt hour units that you need when the generator is operating at its minimum load. And so if you do this sort of simple equation, you'll be able to add this value to your, and incorporate it into your modified offer curve. So let's go to the next slide, slide 19. So again, simple example, these are the same numbers as used in the December analysis. So if you want to, you can. Minimum load cost for this resource is $5,000 an hour. Remember that this is a cost that is borne every hour. So as opposed to startup cost, which is a one-time cost per commitment, minimum load cost occurs every hour, okay? And if you divide that by a resource Pmax of 450, you do the arithmetic, you get $11.11 per megawatt hour. So that becomes another component of the fast start pricing adder with which you add to the incremental cost curve of the resource. And that's where you get the sort of fast start pricing adder from. So let's peek at our next slide and see if this is a good time to stop. Let's go to slide 20. Yeah, it's probably a good time to stop. And then Robert's back in the queue. So we'll stop at slide 19.
Let's try this one more time. James, this is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. My question is about the use of Pmax. The current commitment cost considers Pmin, commitment to a Pmin based upon startup cost, minimum cost, and wanted to kind of consider or ask the question of why the use of Pmax in this situation, and try to understand that idea.
I'll lean on Mike a little bit here too for his perspective, but my understanding is the reason why you amortize over Pmax is that you allow yourself to incorporate those commitment costs regardless of where on the within the resources range they're operating. So if they happen to be operating at their Pmax, they're still incorporating commitment costs at that operating level. Where if you were to amortize only over the Pmin, it sort of shrinks the denominator, which obviously makes the fast start pricing adder a lot higher. And so, in a sense, if you were amortizing over Pmin and operating anywhere above Pmin, you're sort of incorporating more costs into the commitment than you need to amortize. I'm just wondering if Mike, is that your understanding as well? Or you have a different take?
Yeah, what I'd say is that, I mean, so what we're actually describing here is a couple of different things. I mean, there's one assumption that James is going to go through on the next slide, which essentially goes with how you apply the adder. And so what actually happens is that you first assume that that the incremental offer that applied at P-min, that you assume that essentially applies also to the range between 0 output and P-min. And secondly, you add the adder on top of that. So the adder goes on top of everything from 0 megawatts to P-max. So given that, we have a constraint that needs to be obeyed, or else the LP is going to be unhappy, linear program, which is that we have to have a non-decreasing offer curve that's used in the pricing pass. And so if we had a situation where we took all of the commitment costs and we allocated them only to P-min, we could have a situation where the cost at P-min and was higher than the cost exceeding P-min, which means that we violated the assumption. So we have to have a situation where the adjusted offer is either flat or increasing as we go from left to right, increasing from 0 output to P-max output, and simply allocating commitment cost to P-min might violate an assumption. Or if you allocate it all to P-max and you come up with a single adder dollar per megawatt hour that's applied throughout, then that, in combination with the assumption that the P-min price also applies while output less than P-min, will ensure that you don't have a decreasing bid curve, which is something that you need to have.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. The P-min or min load cost and startup cost is variable based on the range that it's committed to. So having the incremental bid cost included in the mid cost. So if you had $1,000 bid, you'd be stuck at P-min, versus if you had a -150 bid, it'd be committing you to 150 or all the way to P-max, is variable. And it concerns me that the 5-minute or in your RTD run, that these two commitment cost considerations would be inconsistent between the 15-minute and how the day ahead is done.
Can you elaborate a little more on that, Robert? I'm not sure I totally follow you.
So if you're considering commitment costs all the way to P-max, you're basically making it much more cost effective because you're not considering bid cost. So like I said, if you had a $1,000 bid, you can still commit the resource at a low cost to P-min, but if you're considering P-max, you can make it even cheaper, even though that high bid cost is, or the bid cost is much higher to get to that point. So that's currently how the market functions. So if you're gonna, is this calculation not gonna be considered in the 15-minute market as well as considered in the day-ahead market? Because that commitment is really, can be variable based upon the combination of all three parts of the bid curve. So if they're inconsistent between the markets, it gives me a little pause.
That I'd make is that in the context of commitment, the market is still using the resource's actual parameters and the three-part bids as you described, where it does its commitment and schedule or optimal schedules. And then the pricing, only in the pricing run do these sort of changes happen. So I don't think that you would get changes in commitment or optimal changes in the optimal schedule based on these assumptions. It's only, these tweaks will only impact the LMP relative to the cost and resource parameters that the resource. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my thought is it may not be economic to commit it in the 15-minute market, but then in the 5, because you're considering the P-max, it makes it more economic to commit it now, based upon the difference in the calculation.
I'd have to think about that some more because it's a nuanced point.
Okay, yeah, I was just thank you for the explanation. It's helpful.
Yeah,
I'll keep thinking about it too. This is the first time I've kind of looked at this, so I'll process this some more. But
Yeah,
thank
and
you for taking my question.
and James is going to be going through some of the methods later, which are, I think, actually, I don't want to completely give it all away, but I think it will actually, to some extent, address some of the concerns which I think are valid with respect to essentially allocating some of the costs that are associated with running at minimum and allocating them to the part of the dispatchable portion of the unit. Even though we'll get to that.
Sounds good. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so slide 20 here. Let's go back to slide 20. So slide 20 here essentially adds more or less the slide from the December 12th analysis, but now with walking it through step by step, hopefully this makes a little more sense, that you have this, I think that's a delta. I don't know, I hope my Greek letters are right, but I think that's a delta. And the delta represents the fast start pricing adder in this case, which encompass the two terms that we described on the previous slide. So you have the minimum load cost over the PMAX, that's amortizing the minimum load cost. And then the second term is the startup cost amortized. And a combination of those two things incorporates the fast start pricing adder. Really here that essentially what it's doing is taking the market bid and adding some scalar to it that incorporates the entire range from PMIN to PMAX. And I will note that in this case, in this visual, the may also, in this case on the far, goes from PMIN to PMAX. But of course, in the fast start pricing logic, we would be relaxing that PMIN constraint all the way down to 0. And so, technically the fast start pricing bid goes all the way from 0 to PMAX in this case, but just a small point. Okay, next slide, please. So here again is an illustration that was done in the December 12th analysis that maybe again will help make a little bit more sense. We have the same resource characteristics in terms of cost on the upper left that we used in the examples where we have a minimum load cost of $5,000 per hour, startup cost of $2,000, minimum uptime of 1 hour, and PMAX of 450. So that's the same numbers as we were using. And essentially, if you were to do the amortization that we did on the previous slide and add them together, it was $4.44 worth of startup cost and $11.11 worth of minimum load cost, and you combine that together and you've got $15.55 as your adder here. And so the light blue portion of the curve is the resource's original bid. And I believe from Guillermo's analysis that this was an anonymized and actual resource bid. So that's interesting. So the blue would represent the incremental portion of the bid, which operates from PMIN to PMAX. And then this darker line represents what the pricing run would see as the bid curve that it would be solving against for pricing purposes. So there's sort of two components here. One is, of course, the adder. So the vertical difference between the light blue and the darker line is that delta, and that's the constant fast start pricing adder that we're seeing here. But then also, you'll notice that if you look at the range of PMIN to 0 in the fast start pricing bid that's used in the pricing run, you would see a value here all the way to 0, and that's also going to incorporate the cost at the lowest segment here. And so that low segment is, in a sense, extended down to 0. And so the dark line would be the one that would be used in the pricing run to calculate the LMPs in this example. So quick pause on this illustration to make sure I can answer any questions or comments here. Okay, question in the queue.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so a couple questions. One, I'll start with the one on this slide right here. So for the portion of the SSP bid, so that gray bid that's below the PMIN, if this unit was dispatched just to PMIN, then the resulting LMP would still be based off of amortizing the minimum load cost and startup costs at PMAX?
Yeah, so the way to think about it, the commitment costs are spread over the entire output. And so if the resource was, so one thing you might be getting at, I'm not sure, but what you might be getting at is that in this case, they're not recovering their full commitment costs at that output level because the commitment is spread out across the entire PMAX. Is that one of the conclusions that you're drawing or thinking about?
Yeah, no, and also the price formation, right? Because this is about price signals. So the LMP, assuming this was the marginal unit, the LMP of this unit would not actually be reflective of its costs operating at PMIN. It'd be something less because, and I know you have to make that decision, right? Do we amortize over PMIN or over PMAX? You have to pick that number. But I just wanted to kind of start thinking about that trade-off. So I guess my question is, am I understanding that correct at this point?
I think that's a fair assumption. It's not recovering or incorporating the full commitment cost at PMIN at that point. And again, the trade-off would be, sort of we talked about with Robert, you can change the way these costs are amortized, or if you look at the equation here on the left where the denominator is 450, if you changed it to 100, which means that you're amortizing the commitment costs over the PMIN, then the fast start pricing adder is 4.5 times higher. And if it was operating at PMIN, it would be recovering its commitment costs and reflecting the commitment costs in the price. However, at that point, if it was operating at any level of higher than PMIN, it's also reflecting more costs than its total cost curve. And so, as I said, there's trade-offs there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's what I was kind of making sure I understood, and I agree. You either have it too high or too low at this PMIN level. So then my second question I had was actually, I think, something that you had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to make sure I understood, and I can't remember if it was in response to JK's question or somebody else. But when we're doing this amortization and we're doing it over the minimum uptime, once this resource has met its minimum uptime, is that adder no longer applied?
In this specific case, yes. But of course, those are also assumptions that are flexible.
Okay. So if you had the exact same resource dispatch, and I know this isn't necessarily a realistic example, it's an extreme one, but let's, entertain me here on this one. If we had the exact same resource dispatch for like 2 hours and this resource had a 1 hour minimum uptime, and it was the marginal unit, you would have different LMPs coming out of the market, even though everything was the same, just because in this case, you're taking off that adder in the second hour.
Yep. Now I will add,
okay.
so one point, so in Mike's comments to the analysis, he pointed out that his recommendation would be, at least for minimum load cost, to amortize the minimum load cost over the entire portion the unit is running. And that's actually consistent with the other markets. As far as I'm aware, all of the other markets that have fast start pricing do amortize minimum load cost specifically over they don't stop at the minimum uptime. I think for startup costs, there's differences, but for minimum load cost, that's pretty consistent. And I know Mike's going to want to jump in about your comment. So Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. A couple of things. First, yeah, I think regardless whether you're amortizing startup cost over minimum uptime or some other period, it doesn't make sense to keep amortizing it after that period's over, because then you're essentially assuming that unit that you keep incurring the startup costs, even though you've already amortized them fully. So if you amortize it over an hour, it doesn't make sense to act as though you're continuing to incur a second startup cost for the second hour. I mean, yes, and then backing up to the first question that you had, Callie, I just wanted to point out that the diagram that James has on the slide does kind of demonstrate the point that I was trying to make in response to Robert's question, which is that suppose we were allocating the adder to the just the minimum load portion as opposed to just the Pmin as opposed to Pmax. It will be 4.5 times higher, which would mean that that gray line that shows essentially what the adder is, what the adjusted offer is, excuse me, that incorporates the adder, that would now be much higher. I don't know what the number would be, but it would be a lot closer to 100 than it is right now. And that would cause a problem if then the next step had a bid that was, 52 or something along those lines. Just doesn't work. We have to go ahead and essentially, we have to have a mechanism for allocating out these commitment costs that ensures that that gray line, the adjusted offer curve, does not have any drops in it. And so the approach that's being illustrated right now, the constant adder approach, is a fairly simple method of doing that because it's constant. We start off with something that's not decreasing, and we add a constant amount for every megawatt hour. For every megawatt that you produce, it'll still be non-decreasing. Then when we get later to the minimum average cost approach, that's a little more sophisticated approach in my view to go ahead and try to deal with that issue while also noting the types of concerns that Robert was raising.
Oh yeah, no, all of that makes complete sense. I was just thinking through kind of the price formation impacts of all the different scenarios. So I want to make sure I had a good understanding of what this case represented. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Next question.
This is J.K. Wang from PG&E. Actually, my question was related to what Kara just asked too. I noticed a small discrepancy in this formulation, the one slide earlier. It seems like the first component that you amortizing the startup cost seems to be the minimum up intervals. And for the second one, and James mentioned that is actually applied to every hour. So, because the denominator are different, I was going to ask whether, how long this is going to be applied, whether it's going to be applied to the minimum up intervals or not. But I think the question are already answered. But then, for the mathematic rigorous, if you notice how this minimum load costs were amortizing, it's not really consistent with how the first component, the startup costs, were amortizing, because it ignores the fact that how much time it will be up. So I guess because you're going to apply it to the analysis, it makes more sense actually to use the same denominator in the two components. Unless there's a reason, I would like to understand that.
So let's a little bit so I can fully follow. So by denominator, you're talking about, in this case, 450 megawatts, and you're saying there's a discrepancy between the way we're amortizing minimum load and startup costs that's causing an issue? Can you help us break that down a little bit?
Right. So in this case, you do not have any problem because it happens to be 450 in both of the components, right? But let's say if your first component that gives you a different answer, if you want to go back to the formulation so you can have a better look, your max 1 and MUT over the delta T, if that doesn't result in a 4, okay, let's say if that's a 3, so you have the P max actually times 45 over 60, you have the P max times a 75%, then you won't have the 45 megawatts as denominator of your first component when you're amortizing the startup cost?
Yeah, so the tricky part here is that there's some dynamics here, because if we go back to this, this is a single interval look, and
Right.
I think your question is that what this equation doesn't show you is that let's imagine that for simplicity, this resource had a 15-minute minimum uptime only. Then you're basically saying, well, then the startup cost and the minimum, the second term in the arithmetic is going to have a different denominator than the first term. So what this equation doesn't show is that, like, in that case, you're only going to have the startup cost incorporated into the overall delta in one interval. And then in the next 3 intervals, if the minimum uptime was only 15 minutes, in the next 3 intervals, that portion goes away over the hour. So the delta is not,
That's really helpful. That was what I was wondering. So you will actually have different adders for that hour, right? So like you will only have the first component during the intervals when you have the minimum uptime, and then for the rest of the hours you will only have the second component. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was what I was wondering. Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
Thank you, JK. Let's go to Alba.
Am I audible? Seem not to be. Can you hear me? I'm not. I see it myself on the transcript, but I'm not seeing James hearing me. So, and my question is for James specifically.
I can hear you.
That's because I'm the one on mute. Sorry.
Okay. I just wanted to follow up on your previous question. It was just a point of interest on other ISOs using fast start pricing. When are these prices incorporated in terms of when prices are published? Is there basically a kind of a change here where the prices that are published in real time are then modified to because you said that they're amortizing over it sounds like some actual time of operation rather than minimum uptime. So what's happening in terms of the publication of prices in those cases?
So it may be more nuanced than I have answer for, but I would imagine that they would be publishing real-time prices using these fast start pricing adders similar to the way that we do, where we would have on our Oasis publishing of these prices. And it's just all incorporated into the LMP structure that, the fast start price is the real-time LMP, and that's the value that gets published.
Yeah, I think that's consistent. I mean, just to address one thing, I mentioned the possibility of doing so. I am not aware that anybody actually has a period they're amortizing these costs over as determined within the dispatch. I mean, it might be the minimum uptime, like an hour. It could be essentially the 15-minute interval that New York uses, which is fixed. It's known in advance. It's set in the tariff. So the numbers in advance, and so given that, you calculate the adjusted offer curve at the same time that you have the actually submitted offer curve, and you can calculate prices and post them kind of the same way you calculate them right now without using the adjusted offer curve.
Okay, so there'd always be something fixed in advance or at the time of dispatch, and not something that could be modified based on anything that would happen after that, except in your utopian model. We'll treat that as utopian for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Ava. Yep. Okay, good questions. All right, so let's move to the next. Oh, you know what? I just discovered I have control of the slides too. Okay, there we go. So we're, that was, okay, so what we walked through as a review, we walked through a way to amortize startup costs, minimum load costs, combine them into a fast start pricing adder that applies over the entire range of the unit with a constant value as we illustrated. So we're going to talk about now a slight variation to that method, which essentially is to modify the minimum load cost portion of the adder. So in this case, just to show the difference between this variant and the last one, what we're adding is two terms here. One is that we're now incorporating the Pmin of the resource, which is the resource's minimum output level. And beta 1 in this case represents the offer price of the first incremental segment in dollars. And so that's you subtract that value from the minimum load cost in the fast start pricing adder. And we'll talk a little bit about why that something like that might make sense. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so minimum load costs, again, they're amortized over the resource's maximum output in this case, but you added this new term here where you're subtracting Pmin times beta 1, which is the first price segment offered by the market participant from the minimum load cost. And essentially, the reason why something like this might be desirable, and we'll get into the nitty gritty, but on a high level, by subtracting this term from the minimum load cost, you're accounting for the variable cost that's already covered in the first bid segment. So you know that minimum load cost incorporates the cost of operating at hourly cost of operating at Pmin, and then the first segment of the incremental bid curve starts from Pmin to whatever the first wherever the first dispatchable segment ends. And so in a way, you might actually be double counting some cost in this without making the subtraction. So what this term does is it reflects now when you do minimum load cost minus Pmin times beta 1, you're reflecting the additional cost per megawatt hour of operating the generator at its minimum load. That's above the incremental cost that's already included for the resource's output at Pmin through beta 1. So, well, that might sound a little convoluted, so hopefully we can make it make more sense in the next couple of slides. So this next slide, essentially, we're going to take the same illustration as we did in the previous slide and adjust it to, oops, sorry. Let's go to slide 24. It's the same illustration, except now the fast start pricing adder has changed. In this case, we have subtracted out the Pmin of this resource, if we assume is 100 megawatts, and beta 1, which is the first segment of the incremental cost curve, is $35. Now you'll notice in the calculation for delta that we have subtracted 100 megawatts times $35 per megawatt hour, which is $3,500 from the total cost to amortize, which means that you've essentially taken the fixed quantity and divided and subtracted out this value, and now you have a fast start pricing adder that's half of the size that it was in this case. It's only half because that's how the numbers work out, but in any case, it's a smaller quantity than it was. And so now your fast start pricing adder in this case is a little bit smaller. Again, you're still extending the bid segment all the way to 0 in this case, but the fast start pricing adder is a touch smaller. Let's go to the next slide and see if that's a good place to stop. So I want to sort of point out, if I could, with an example, why if you do not subtract out these costs, it might be problematic. And that's because by not subtracting out these costs, what you've essentially done is to make the fast start pricing, the fast start resource more expensive on a total cost basis in the pricing run than it actually is in the scheduling run. And so you may have, you know, weird things happening with your pricing path in this case. So these numbers and these examples don't match up perfectly with the example that we've been doing, but they're from Mike's comments, and you can review those comments on our Price Formation Initiative webpage. But essentially, the punchline here is that in the table on the top, where you have, in this case, a resource that has a PMIN and a minimum load cost of $7,000, which is reflected here under cost to block. And then it has two incremental cost curves of 50 megawatts each, where the first increment is a $40 offer and the second increment is an $80 offer. So in terms of cumulative cost, if you were to consider the cumulative cost of that resource at its maximum output, you would have a cumulative cost of $13,000. And again, remember that cumulative cost is in the scheduling run, the optimization is incorporating the fixed cost into its decision whether or not to commit this unit in the first place. And so that cumulative cost does become important for, you know, scheduling and dispatch purposes. And then when you look at on the right-hand side of that top table under the term constant adder, and you were to basically amortize those fixed costs, the $7,000 costs into the offer curve, essentially, if you work out the arithmetic, you get a cumulative cost of that resource that's a lot higher than its actual total cumulative cost in the scheduling run. And because those values don't add up, you've essentially made the fast start resource more expensive in the pricing run than it actually looks in the scheduling run. So on the bottom, this sort of overpayment, I don't, maybe overpayment's the wrong word, but this sort of thing is fixed by essentially subtracting out the cost of the first incremental curve at the PMIN from the fast start pricing adder, in which case, we're not going to go through all the arithmetic here, but Mike's example in his comments do have the arithmetic there. But what you've essentially done is you made the cumulative cost equal in this case. And so the pricing run and scheduling run sees the fast start resources being, you know, the same total cost. So it doesn't sort of shuffle the resources between, or doesn't have the desire to shuffle these resources between the two scheduling and pricing runs. Mike, is there anything, before we go to Alva's question, is there anything you want to add on to this before we move on?
Yeah, the only thing, on video here, is the only thing I wanted to mention is that the $4,000, that is reflective of the incremental bid for that first block, so $40 times the PMIN, which is 100. The question might be, so that's $4,000. And so the question might be, so why? Why am I comparing the bid for the second block, the incremental block, times the capacity for the first block? And that's because, you know, the idea here is that we start with essentially extending. We come up with the adjusted offer curve. We begin by extending that incremental block one offer to the PMIN segment. So we basically say, well, let's assume that the incremental bid for that was $40. Well, in that case, the problem here is that if we can calculate the adder while also including the $40 for that 100 megawatts of capacity, we'll have double counted it. That's the $4,000 difference that we're getting between the variant 1 and the variant 2 approaches. Whereas if we simply say, gee, given the assumption that it's going to cost $40 per megawatt hour to operate at 100 megawatts, and the fact that our actual cost of commitment cost is $7,000 to produce that 100 megawatts, that's a $3,000 difference. And so it only takes into account commitment costs to the extent they haven't already been covered by the assumption that the incremental offer for the first block will also apply to the payment block.
Thanks, Mike. Before we go to Alva's question, I want to mention in a question in the chat from Callie on slide 24, can you help me understand why the fast start pricing bid isn't just shifted up consistently across the operating range like the previous variant? So there does seem to be a small error in the dark blue portion of the bid between 100 and 200. It should be stepped all the way down, as Callie is suggesting it should. So apologize for the for that, but you essentially would see the portion between 150 and 175 perhaps be shifted down a little bit, and the portion between 100 and 150 shifted down. So it would continue that blocky pattern all the way down.
Yeah, the example on slide 25 might be, you know, it doesn't have the error. Basically, you can see that there's a constant adder of $35 being added under the variant 1 approach. So we go from assumed level of 40 to 75 for both the PMIN and the Inc. 1 block, 80 to 115 for the Inc. 2 block. So again, adding 35 in each case. And then under the variant 2 approach, which is on the bottom part of the slide, we're adding 15 to either the assumed offer for PMIN or the actual offers for Inc. 1 and Inc. 2. So it's that constant adder is in fact constant. It's just constant at a different level.
Yep, thanks, Mike. Let's go to Alva.
Hello. This is actually a question for Mike. So I'm just not absorbing all the details, but the thing I see in this example is that it has the nice feature that if a resource is marginal, it's essentially recovering its costs exactly through the modified structure here. It costs 13,000, it recovers 13,000. And that's kind of something we would like to see in a competitive market, right? That the marginal resource exactly recovers its costs. The question I was wondering about, I just wonder if you've looked at it, does this sort of maybe I'm mischaracterizing it also, so you can correct me, but does that hold if you've got multiple resources that are involved in setting the costs? Do you get kind of a good ordering of resources still in terms of the marginal resource is exactly recovering its cost, but other resources that get more than cost recovery are essentially cheaper? Can you be assured of that, or is it possible for this pricing system to lead to results that would be counter to that, kind of basic idea of economics?
Yeah. I mean, certainly under the latter approach, the cumulative cost when you're fully dispatched is reflecting your cumulative cost according to your actual offer. So assuming that reflects your true cost. And we'll get away from the issues about how long we should allocate the startup cost over. That gets a little bit more complicated than I think we want to get to. So we'll assume that we really should be allocating it over 1 hour. Let's see. So we have I'm trying to figure out the right way to answer this. What we would be doing is what that does is it avoids making the unit appear to be more expensive than it truly is, which would I'm having trouble kind of translating this into the question you were asking, because in a situation where that unit is on the margin with that second incremental block, for example, it's going to be making $95 a megawatt hour for at least $150, 150 megawatts of output, probably more. So it's going to be making a positive profit, even though it's we're reflecting its cumulative cost correctly, and we're actually committing this unit using its actual offers. So the modified offer bids, the adjusted offer bids we use in the pricing dispatch don't actually matter for that purpose. So,
Okay. So
Yeah.
you know the dispatch, the commitment is still going to lead to the most economic commitment. I guess you have to think about all of this in terms of signals for the future as well. And in the first case,
Yeah.
the resource is getting more than its costs. And that's going to be seen by other resources as well. I guess that's kind of the context I was thinking about it, but I appreciate what you're saying there.
Yeah, and it might be getting more than its cost, but also it might not be, you know, we'll get into this in a little bit in a few slides here, but you know, yeah, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alva. Let's go to Adam.
Yeah, thanks for this example. This is Adam Cornelius with Snohomish PUD again. I just want to test my understanding. If this resource, you know, under like kind of second example or option here, if this resource is operating, you know, below that second incremental, then it appears to me that the cumulative cost is less than its actual cost. Is that right? So if it's at PMIN or in its first increment of 50 megawatts, those cumulative cost numbers on the right, lower right, are less than the actual offer.
Right. Yeah.
Under the second variant.
What's that?
Under variant 2, under the second.
Yep, under variant 2, correct.
That's correct, yes.
So that sounds like it's kind of a trade-off that we're, you know, that you'd be making by
Yeah.
going with variant 2.
You incur all these costs when you operate at PMIN. And then to the extent that the constant adder approach allocates some of those costs to one or both of the incremental segments, but we get to the same number for the total cost of operating the unit at max, that means that you'll be below that when the unit's not operating at max.
Yeah, okay. Just making sure I was reading that correctly. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. And then go to the next slide. I think I'm going to pass it over to Mike. For next couple of slides, if that's okay. But we're actually going to switch now to variant 3. And before we move, let me just review the two variants we talked about. First, we talked about amortizing startup costs, load costs over the resources PMAX and minimum uptime to establish an adder that would be applied to the resources bid curve for use in the pricing run. The second variant essentially is very similar to the first, except that there's some costs that are taken out of the commitment cost calculation in order to get the total cost of the resource at its PMAX to match the total cost of the resource under both to get its total cost for its actual offer curve and actual commitment cost to match the total cost at PMAX under its modified offer curve to be the same. And as Adam pointed out, there can be trade-offs between those options. Now we're going to switch over to what we're calling the minimum average cost variant. So it's still a modified offer curve approach, but its techniques are a little bit different than what we're talked about for the first two variants. I'm going to ask Mike if he could sort of transition us to how it's done. He's put together a couple slides to describe why would we even think of this in the first place, and what sort of rationale would we have of doing something like minimum average cost. So Mike, take us away.
Thanks. Yeah, so yeah, that was I felt it was important to say, so why on earth are we doing this? So let's go ahead and consider a unit that's just like the one that we were talking about on the previous slide, except that for right now, that second incremental block doesn't exist. So the PMIN block is 100 megawatts. The commitment costs sum to 7,000, minimum uptime an hour. We have $7,000 in commitment costs that we need that will incur when we operate at PMIN. And then we have another incremental segment with 50 megawatts, and it costs $40 to operate. So what's the total cost of running this unit at 150 megawatts for an hour. It's going to be the $7,000 of commitment costs, another $2,000 to use the incremental segment to produce another 50 megawatts. So your total cost is going to be $9,000. You're going to allocate that over 150 megawatt hours. And so the total cost of operating it at 150 is going to be $60 a megawatt hour. So that's a relatively simple approach. And if you were to, run through the how we're doing variant 2 anyway of the constant adder approach, that is what you would come up with. You'd get essentially an offer of $60 a megawatt hour would be applied to the entire 150 megawatts of the unit. Okay. Now, I can't move the slides again. Can we go to the next slide? Thanks. Now let's go ahead and modify that. Let's consider a twin, except that for the twin version of this unit, it has that second incremental segment. It has another 50 megawatts of capacity, and for the time being, let's suppose that it's really expensive, more expensive than the $80 that I assumed in the previous table from a couple slides ago. $800. I don't know, whatever you want the number to be, something that's extremely expensive. So it's almost never used. The question is, okay, so how should that affect the adjusted offer curve for the first 150 megawatts? I've just essentially added what is overall almost all the time this unused appendix of 50 megawatts to this unit that really doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the cost of committing the unit. It probably has very little to do with actually operating the unit most of the time because you've got this 50 megawatts there that you really don't want to use. Should it really affect the adjusted offer for running the first 150 megawatts? And so I would say that it really shouldn't. That essentially that the adjusted offers that we use for the first 150 megawatts of this unit should be the same as the adjusted offers for the unit that didn't have this additional segment. The only difference between the two units is that one has an additional 50 megawatts that you never used. So why should the adjusted offers for the first 150 megawatts be affected by whether the unit has an additional 50 megawatts on top that is never used, or it doesn't have an additional 50 megawatts that's never used? Now the problem is that under the can we go to the next slide? Slide 28, please. Thanks. So the problem is that under the constant adder approach, we would do that. We would take a portion of the commitment costs and we would allocate that to that second 50 megawatt segment that's almost never used for the one unit, and for the unit that doesn't have an additional 50 megawatt segment, we wouldn't allocate it. So we would have different costs for operating with the first 150 megawatts under a constant adder approach, depending upon whether we add or don't add 50 megawatt segment that's almost never used. So the idea here was, let's go ahead and come up with an approach that is intended to avoid situations like that, and have essentially capacity that is either not going to be used, or let's put it this way, not really going to affect the commitment of the unit. To go ahead and why should it be included in the adjusted cost for that unit? So essentially the idea is that the adjusted offer for these two units should be the same. And then there's an additional benefit associated with this. The calculation that's being used to come up with the adder is the minimum load cost minus, under variant 2 anyway, it's the minimum load cost minus the incremental bid for that first incremental segment times the P-min. Well, that's something that can be manipulated. Okay, what you can do is you can go ahead and submit a relatively low offer for a very small, let's call it a 1 megawatt. We can create a 1 megawatt segment of your P-min and put a very low offer in for that 1 megawatt segment. Well, okay, if we're going ahead, we're calculating the adder as minimum load cost minus the P-min times that very low offer. All of a sudden, we just massively inflated the size of the adder. Okay, and that adder is then going to be used to go ahead and increase offers across the board throughout the entire unit. So under the constant adder approach, what that can do is essentially give you a situation where you can have, you're dispatching the unit based upon one set of offer curves, and then pricing dispatch, the pricing run, uses a set that if somebody, plays the game that I've described here, could make that unit appear to be much more expensive for its incremental segments. And so as a consequence, that's a situation where to some extent you have these, it's exploiting the inconsistencies between the offer curves that are used in the pricing run and in the dispatch run. And so what you want is an approach that is going to be more resistant to approach it, more resistant to attempts to manipulate the offers like that. And so anyway, so that's another part of the rationale for why minimum average cost amortization, which has not been described to you yet, but which will be described in a moment, has been proposed. Are there any questions, or it'll probably make more sense to ask questions after after James has actually illustrated how it would work, but.
I appreciate that. I hope it gives a good transition into thinking about why this variant is being thought of. And I just want to point out that the minimum average cost adder is a technique that's used in New York, right, Mike? And so it is implemented in another market. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, so we're getting back into needing to break down some equations here. Essentially, I actually kind of want to start your attention at the bottom of the slide, and then we're going to work our way back to the top. So essentially, the purpose of these calculations on the screen is to find the segment that we'll call segment I that provides the lowest average cost of production, considering both the variable and the fixed cost. So you want to find the segment that provides the lowest average cost of production, and you're going to do that first by the top equation. I don't even know what that Greek letter is. Looks like a trident to me, but you're going to define that as the average cost of the segment I. And all this equation does is it's taking your startup cost plus your minimum load cost plus the incremental cost at each dispatchable portion of the bid curve. And so PI represents, all the P's represent quantities, in where, just if we look at this an illustration, the difference between PK and PK minus 1 are the megawatt segments between each incremental bid. And beta represents the price. And you're going to sum that over the entire bid range. And so this fancy summation is just adding up the incremental cost of each bid segment, incremental bid segment. And then we have this familiar term here where you're going to make sure that the value is in, you're amortizing the value over the right time interval, which is where this max function with minimum uptime comes in. And this delta T over 60 ensures that you're using dollar per megawatt hour values. So that term, which a colleague has told me that symbol is psi, PSI. So psi is the average cost of each segment. And then this is going to yield a minimum average price here, where you take basically that top function, and you're saying I'm going to find the I'm going to apply delta by finding the incremental segment that produces the minimum average cost, or the lowest, that minimizes the average cost function. So if we look at the next slide, which has sort of illustrations, maybe that will make a little bit more sense, and then we can come back to this. So here's a resource that has, in the top left, a bid-in price, which is in this, in reality, this would be a stepwise function, but in this simplified case, it's a linear function. and then you're adding on the average cost of the minimum load and startup cost, which gives you this downward sloping curve. And you were to add them together, essentially you get this parabola shape average price curve. And the goal of this delta is to find exactly the point where your average price curve is minimized. So let's go back to this. You think here this delta is finding the point on this average cost curve that's the smallest value. Okay, so that's what the role of delta does. And the top curve, the top function here, psi, is essentially giving you this, parabola-shaped average cost. Okay, let's take the first question before we move on. And I do apologize. I see a note in the chat that for some people the screens, the slides weren't advancing. So we are on slide 30, and I was just clicking back and forth between slide 29 and slide 30 to relate the visual on the slide to the equations on slide 29. Let's take the first question.
Yes, can we go back to slide 29, please?
Sure.
Because there is a, from a cost recovery standpoint, the stepwise function that is utilized for the bid curves tends to understate our incremental cost, right? Because function steps left to right. And here we're using the BK value or the beta K value, which is essentially maintaining that left to right. Is there any chance that that can be changed to the beta K plus 1 to go from right to left?
So in this case, so this function here, the sum from K1 to I, is essentially taking all of the incremental cost values. So if you're the difference between all of your incremental segments are 50 megawatts, then it's going to take 50 megawatts times the bid price of that segment, plus 50 megawatts times the bid price of the next segment, and it's going to add them all up into the total cost for as many segments and prices as you have. And so then what is the variance that you're saying? Mm-hmm.
So that is understood. I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
The bid segment between the 2 points, right? So if you want, you could take the break points at the bottom, for example, okay? So the break points at the bottom, the price of the break points at the bottom is based on the lower of the 2 break points. And it stays that price until you get to the next break point, and then it does an instantaneous jump up, right? That's the step function that is utilized. Mm-hmm. But that step function results in an under recovery of costs, right? Because if your breakpoints are set according to your incremental heat rate curve, the step function is always underneath the curve, right? So my question is there a way to set it so that this function will calculate going right to left instead of left to right in the step function? So I want you to take the price from breakpoint 1 and say that's the price for everything between 1 and 0. Take the price for breakpoint 2, set that is the price for everything between 2 and 1, as opposed to going the other way.
I see what you're saying. So you're basically saying for any given segment, you're defining the breakpoint as being the price with which you're transitioning from the segment behind you and not the segment in front of you, kind of as simple as I can put it. Is that right?
Yeah, the way the function is set up right now, it's the segment behind you. And I'm asking if we can set it to the segment in front of you. The segment you're going to for the price.
Yeah, and I for the purpose of this presentation, this will be how it's set up, but I understand the variant you're proposing, and I think we can definitely talk about that. That's not how it's going to be written up in today's slides, but I think that's an interesting thing to consider that we can take forward.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I just want to note to panelists that the audience, I'm sorry that when I try to move the slides on my end, it only shows up on my screen. So when I'm going back and forth between slides, nobody else is seeing it. So I'll make sure to call out to the operator to switch slides in the future. Okay, let's go to JK.
James, thanks for the graphs. Those are really helpful, and thanks for bringing down the equations. Quick clarification the formulation, the first formulation, the first term is STUC. Is that the same as the startup cost, or yeah, that's a typo? Okay.
Yeah. I tried to. So in the December 12th presentation, STUC was the term that was used, and I try to change them all to SUC to not get people confused with STUC or short-term unit commitment. So I just forgot this one.
No problem, thanks. And another question is, I understand what this equation wants to do, but I want to clarify with you, what's the application condition? Is that only to the case that Mike showed us before, like when there is a very high cost of the resources that seems like make the resources never be dispatched, or like, because I mean, it could be any resources, right? It seems there's no limitation of the equation itself can be applied to any step functions. So just want to clarify with you, is there, application conditions for this to be used?
Yeah, so the application condition this would only apply to the fast start resources. So, but it wouldn't apply to any generic resource. So only the fast start, and it would be applied to any fast start resource, regardless if they have, because some resources may be block loaded, or in that case they wouldn't. They may only have one, or they may not even have an incremental segment to include in this case. Mike, do you want to add anything on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might actually be useful if, I just to motivate why we were looking at this, I used an example where that second incremental block was extremely expensive, but I still think it makes sense even in situations where it's expensive, but not stratospherically so. I mean, if we could go back to slide 25. So it's not calculated here, but let's go ahead and think about exactly how we would do the minimum cost approach in this example. So it costs $7,000 to operate. That's your commitment cost. It costs $7,000 to operate for an hour at PMIN, which is 100. So that's $70 per megawatt hour. Okay. Now we can go ahead and increase our output from 100 to 150. Is that going to decrease our average cost? Yes, it will, because it costs $40 per megawatt hour to increase your average cost. We know $40 is 70. And so that we know that essentially if we were to generate another 50 megawatts at $40 each, we're going to decrease our average cost compared to a situation where we were running at 100 megawatts and it cost us $70 on average. So at $150, what does it cost us to run? Well, we have a cumulative cost of 9,000 under the actual offer curve. Divide that by 150 megawatts of output, that's $60 per megawatt hour, which is a number that I actually calculated in one of the slides earlier. But our average cost was $70 PMIN. We go up to 150 megawatts, so our average cost is $60. Will we go further? No, we shouldn't, because the capacity of the third block is offered at an $80 price. 80 is more than 70, so that we know that if we start getting into that third block, second incremental block, we will start to increase the average cost. But we know what the output level that minimizes the average cost here is offered at 100 megawatts and have a $60 offer. So under the minimum average cost approach, the adjusted offer would be $60 for the first 150 megawatts and $80 for the next 50 megawatts. Okay. So basically it would use the average cost at minimum, the average cost at 150 megawatts. That would define the adjusted offer for 150 megawatts. And then past that point where you minimize the average cost, just uses the adjusted offer curve equals the actual offer curve. And so what that does is it essentially avoids the situation that you would get even under the second variant of the constant adder approach, excuse me, which is shown in the bottom table here, where we have a $95 offer approach. So what that's doing is essentially it's saying that, look, once I'm operating at minimum, I've already gone ahead and accounted for all of the commitment costs associated with this unit. They've already been, fully wrapped in when I use a $60 offer for the first 150 megawatts, because that fully recovers the $9,000 cost of operating at 150 megawatts. So from that point forward, I'll actually just use the adjusted curve, and the actual offer curves will be the same. So that will essentially avoid situations where, let's say, you might have a $90 unit that is an alternative to dispatching this unit. In reality, you would dispatch that unit, but then the $90 offer would go ahead and set the price because it's cheaper than the $95 offer they would get under the constant adder approach. This approach says that, if the second block of this unit is truly on the margin and it's $80 marginal cost, it would set the price at $80. So it avoids situations where essentially you have a unit that's on the margin using something like the second incremental block of this unit, but doesn't set the price despite the fact that it's on the margin. Anyway, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I still need to go back and to revisit example, but
Sure.
yeah, I'm still learning about this. So
Yep.
effectively, would you have an adder? Because when I look at a equation, it seems that this adder will be more expensive than variant 2. Is that right?
No, it would be exactly the same. It would be, you'd have the $60 offer for the first 150 megawatts, and that would cover $9,000 of cost. And then the next 50 megawatts would be at $80 each. So 80 times 50 is 4,000. So we had 9,000 covered in the first 150, another 4,000 in the next 50. That's a total of $13,000 in cost. So it wouldn't be any more expensive. What it would do is it would allocate, compared to the variant 2, which is in the bottom half of the slide, it would allocate more of that cost to P-min and Inc. 1 and less of it to Inc. 2. And that would help to address some of the concerns, for example, that Robert Fisher was expressing earlier about essentially we're going ahead and we're allocating the cost of this unit, the commitment costs, over the entire unit. But what this would do is it would allocate those commitment costs solely for the first 150 megawatts. And what this approach really does is essentially, the idea here is to basically allocate as much of the commitment cost to the left part of the unit as you can.
Gotcha.
Subject to the constraint that you cannot have a decreasing offer curve. That's why you need to allocate part of the cost to the incremental 1 block. But the idea is essentially to use the actual offer curve as much as you can and to allocate as much of the cost associated with committing the unit to the lower output levels as you can. So it's essentially, right. So it's essentially, trying to come as close as we can to trying to allocate as much of the cost to the lower capacity levels as we can, subject to the constraint that we cannot have decreasing offer curves, and subject to a constraint that we don't want to make the unit look more or less expensive to operate at full output than it truly is. We don't want the cumulative cost to be less than or more than 13,000 when it's operating under its adjusted offer curve at 200 megawatts.
Gotcha. Okay, that's interesting because your adder that fee part is actually dependent on the segment. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
And if you want more details on exactly how this calculation works, it's all laid out in the memo that with comments that I put together on the last presentation, which I believe is posted on the website, right, James?
Yep, it's on our price formation under the December 12th meeting. You can find his comments there.
Yep. So there's more detail there.
Okay, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alba?
Yeah, I'm not a convert to this concept yet, but I do think this third option has some nice features, perhaps because of having been around for a long time. This is very similar to the way things have been thought about in terms of units being dispatched to their most efficient point, and then from that point up, seeing their true incremental costs. I think this this, and just the way you just went through it, Mike, in terms of getting full compensation at the point of maximum efficiency, basically, and then from that point up, recovering based on your incremental costs. I do think this approach would have better incentive effects than either of the former two. If we look at this not just as compensation, but also in terms of what you're trying to incent resources to do in the future, or how they look at themselves in respect to other resources, I think this approach has a lot to recommend it.
Thanks, Alva. Yeah, we just to note that it is the method that the New York ISO has implemented, and so it's been in practice since maybe 2019, Mike, or how long has it been implemented there?
They implemented it at the end of 2020.
Okay.
Yeah. So a little over 3 years. And actually, Callie has a question here too. I mean, do you want me to take it, or do you want to take it, James?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just read it. From a price formation perspective, then this approach will only impact prices when the unit is operating below the point where the adder is included. And yeah, I mean, I don't even know if adder is really quite the right approach, right? It's because it's a way of coming up with an adjusted offer curve, but of course it's not adding a constant amount like the constant adder is. But yes, generally beyond the minimum average cost point, the actual offer curve and the adjusted offer curves would be the same. So to the extent that the unit in the pricing pass is being operated in that range, between the minimum average cost and Pmax, you'd get the same price. Of course, there may be a lot of units where, in this unit, in this particular example, the adjusted and actual offer curves are the same for the last 50 megawatts. There are going to be a lot of units which that's not true. Their minimum average cost may be full output, for example. So in that case, there will be no range for that unit between the minimum average cost and Pmax. But to the extent that you have a unit like this, and essentially it's operating at 172 megawatts in the pricing pass, then the use of fast start pricing would not be affecting prices in that particular case. It's essentially on the margin of the pricing pass in that range.
Thanks, Mike. And I think some of the illustrations will help circle us back on that point too. It might be helpful to see that. Okay, I think we're on slide 29, if I'm not mistaken. We'll go one further, slide 30. Okay, and then one further, slide 31. So this is the illustration I was talking about, well, at least part of it. So in this illustration, what we have is the same, in light blue, you have the same incremental bit curve for this anonymized resource. And then now in dark blue or the dark color, you have the resource's average cost curve. And so you have the same metrics and same values applied to the minimum load cost, startup cost, minimum uptime, Pmin, Pmax is all the same. You're essentially this delta zero is calculating the average cost at every segment. So in this case, if you have a minimum load and startup cost of combined cost of $7,000 over the 100 megawatt segment from 0 to Pmin, then your average cost over that segment is $70. And it's doing that. So the next segment of the delta curve would be delta 1, which includes into the calculation the incorporation of the cost at the next bid segment, beta 1, from 100 to maybe 150, it looks like. And each step of that average cost curve is going to decline until you get to this point, delta M, which represents the minimum point. And then after delta M, every segment on the average cost curve is then increasing. So if we go to slide 32, to connect to Callie's question, essentially then that the adder, the fast start pricing adder under the minimum average cost methodology applies the adder only to segments of the incremental bid curve that are at or below the minimum average cost. And so in the case where, in this case, we're extending to the left the minimum average cost portion all the way to 0. And so actually, let's move up. Can we move up to slide 33? That might be a better, oh, never mind. Let's go back to slide 32. Sorry about that. So in this case, the portions of the incremental bid curve in between P-min and the point on the bid curve that minimizes the average cost are being changed to the fast start pricing value beta 1M, which is applied to that point. And then everywhere above that point, the fast start pricing bid is the same value as the original bid, as Mike pointed out. So anywhere between, which looks like maybe 260 up to 450, includes the same values as the original offer curve. Let's pause here to make sure that's clear if there's any clarifying questions or comments at this point. Okay, let's move to slide 33. So this particular picture, this is from the December 12th analysis, and this is comparing variant 1 to variant 3. So we don't have variant 2 on the slide, but you remember that variant 2, essentially what that looks like is the variant 1 line, which is the dark color, and essentially variant 2 is half of that value in our example. So you would see variant 2 fit somewhere right in between the original bid, which is in light blue, and the variant 1 bid, which is in dark blue. It would fit halfway in between there in a stepwise manner. And then you can see for the average minimum average cost methodology, instead of having the stepwise function from the minimum point all the way to 0, you actually have a flat adder from 0 to that minimum average point. And then again, as we mentioned, after that point, the fast start pricing bid under the minimum average cost methodology keeps the same values above that minimum average point as the original offer curve. So you can see at various points in the bid range where how the different prices might look under this specific example relative to the variant 1 and variant 3 to the original offer curve. Any questions or comments on this slide before we move on? Okay, let's go to slide 34. Okay, so that concludes our discussion about modified offer curves. So just to review all 3 variants, there's 3 variants out there that we can use or consider as part of the overall method of using a modified offer curve to apply fast start pricing. The first we showed amortizing minimum load costs and startup costs over the resources maximum output and minimum runtime, and applying a constant adder over every portion of the bid curve. The second variant is the same basic concept, except that the amortized costs are slightly different, where you're subtracting out the cost of the operating the unit at its P-min and subtracting out that beta 1 cost to keep the total cost of the resource the same. The third variant uses the minimum average cost methodology, where you're finding the point on the resource's average cost curve, the minimum point, and then you're including sort of a modified offer curve for that resource only on portions of the curve that are portions of the bid segment that are below that minimum average cost point. And then everything above the minimum average cost, you're keeping the same values. So those are 3 different ways of using minimum or modified offer curves to facilitate fast start pricing. The methods used in New York are again more like variant 3, which is the minimum average cost. The methods that are used in SPP, ISO New England, are more like variance 1, which is essentially just providing the constant adder approach. And then to provide sort of a holistic view about the different methods, there's also a second high-level way of doing it, which is integer relaxation. That's broadly used in PJM and also in MISO. We're not going to talk about it in as much detail as we did for the modified offer curves, but we just thought for completeness, people might want to know, what the full set of methods there are out there. So instead of, for integer relaxation, instead of taking the original offer curve and adding some value to it to make a modified offer curve that you run through the pricing run, integer relaxation has a slightly different way of doing it, where to incorporate the commitment cost into the marginal price, it relaxes the integrality constraint. Integrality constraint in this context means that the unit commitment variable in the optimization problem is normally fixed to be either a value of 0 or a value of 1. Okay, so it's a binary variable that's 0 or 1. And what integer relaxation does is essentially says, for fast start resources, I can take that constraint, and instead of making it binary, I can make it continuous. And so the value of the unit commitment variable can actually vary between 0 and 1 and can be fractions in between. So that's what's explained in the sub-bullet here. Instead of the commitment status being between or exactly 1 or exactly 0, you can define the unit commitment variable over a bound between 0 and 1. So what that does is it allows the marginal generator's commitment cost to be included within the marginal price, because the unit commitment variable can actually be marginal in this case, since it's a continuous variable, and it's spread out over the resource's maximum output. So it's kind of a way to integrate incorporating commitment cost into the marginal price without using a modified offer curve, and it's sort of done automatically through the through this relaxation of that constraint. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to sort of leave it here for this method and make this statement that at a high level, the integer relaxation method is essentially a different mathematical process that results, or seems to at least result, in the same prices as long as you're allocating the same costs over the same period. And so for that purposes, it didn't make sense to us in this workshop to go through specific examples of the integer relaxation method, just because the outputs or the pricing values that you would get would be exactly the same as long as you're using the same costs over the same period. And for that purpose, our intention is also not to include integer relaxation as a method in our fast start pricing analysis, for the same reasons, that you're essentially, as long as you have the same cost of the same periods, you're going to get the same numbers. And so from our view, it would be redundant to include that as a method. Now, there's a big disclaimer there that obviously the way that integer relaxation is implemented in PJM and implemented in MISO may be different in the details. And so, we're talking about integer relaxation at a very high level. And so, of course, if stakeholders find it desirable, or I guess if CAISO also finds it desirable to think more about integer relaxation as a method as it comes down to policy, we can have those discussions in the future. So it's not to say that the integer relaxation method is completely off the table for a policy discussion, but just in terms of the analysis, it doesn't seem to make sense to include that. If you're interested in the integer relaxation method, there's a link here to a PJM report that has a mathematical discussion of the integer relaxation method. So if you follow that link, start on PDF page 32, you can get a feel for, with some examples, some nice examples of how the integer relaxation method works in PJM. And if you're similarly interested in MISO, which uses a slightly different, what they call ELMP method, we can also reach out to us. We can see if we can work on getting that detail as well. We just thought that this specific PJM report was very clear on the basics. And so if you're interested in the basics, that's a good place to look. Let's go to slide 36. Okay, so slide 35 is the end of our technical material. So I'd like to go back and see if there are any last minute questions, clarifications, or suggestions perhaps for gaps that we can help fill as stakeholders are learning about South Star pricing. Let's start with JK.
JK Wong from PG&E. First of all, I really appreciate James and Kaiso to prepare this presentation, really helpful for us to understand the basis of analysis and the overview of all the South Star pricing practice. And I understand when you say that because of the way that integer relaxation is implemented, the Kaiso is not planned to include that in analysis. But I wonder if, the results of the two different approach would differ in the markets. And I'm asking this question because, if we only use one method, like the modified the curves, but not using the other, how much can we interpret the results will be extendable to the other type of approach? If the Kaiso can provide any reasoning, like how similar the results will be in, my understanding is sometimes they can differ a lot because the mathematic basics behind them are actually different. And would that be a range estimation in terms of the results difference so we can interpret analysis better?
Yeah, so at this time, given what we know and playing around with it a little bit and asking around, our understanding is that, again, as long as you're amortizing the same costs over the same period, that whether you were to use the integer relaxation technique or the modified offer curve technique, you would get the exact same pricing output. And for that reason, because you would get the exact same numbers, it seems to us redundant to include that in the analysis. However, for a policy discussion, there may be advantages or disadvantages to using integer relaxation as if the Kaiso were to pursue Fast Start pricing as the way we would actually implement Fast Start pricing. And so for a policy discussion, of course, it's on the table. It just feels like, because the analysis, the purpose of the analysis is essentially to provide an understanding of the general impact to the market that Fast Start pricing would have. And if the integer relaxation method and the modified offer curve approach result in the same prices, then you don't really learn anything from including that in the analysis. That's kind of our perspective as of right now.
Yeah, I'm kind of like, questioning that, because if they were resulting in the price very closely, then there's even no point to discuss the other ones, right? Because then basically, after we implemented, it will still result the same price and sending the same market signal. And what Kaiso said, the price will be the same. Is there any data possible to share with the stakeholders so we can we can have the same assumption more confidently?
So we've, I guess what you would need to fill in that gap is essentially to, we can share, let me see what I can do in the time that we have to share what all that we know in terms of comparing those methods, because it would involve publishing a solver, coming up with examples, that sort of stuff, which we've done behind the scenes.
That would be really helpful. Yeah, even like a small example, like make those two comparable, right? So later, because my understanding is Kaizo is going to look at extensive data using one method, which is fair considering the time. But if we can, have a small example before diving into the big data, to show those methods are actually comparable in most of the cases. And if not, in some scenarios, my understanding is they will be different. Like, let's list those scenarios, and we don't have to look at both methods with the same level of data. But have that understanding in the beginning, I believe will be very, very meaningful.
Yeah, and okay, we can, I understand the request, and we can work on that. Now, I do have a very important caveat here, which is that I'm describing integer relaxation at a very, very high level. And my conclusion about getting similar or the same prices as you would under a modified offer curve approach is not a statement about the subtle difference, or the differences that, for example, PJM and MISO are going to use different assumptions, different mathematics to calculate the price. And so I would not apply that statement to say that when you get down to the specific details of how PJM and MISO implements it, that you would get the same numbers as how New York and all that stuff, because all of them have slightly different implementations of that. But if you were to isolate, or if you were to sort of control for all of as many variables as possible and only tweak the method between integer relaxation and modified offer curves, we're confident that you would get the same prices. But we can do more to justify that conclusion if that's desirable.
Yes, that's fully understood, and also we understood, analysis is for a different purpose. When it comes to the simulation, we care more about, especially the policy design, we care more about, in specific cases, how it's going to send the market signal proper. But at an analysis level, at a high level, we're kind of want to look at market cost and overall benefits. So those are for different purposes. But if, the Kaizo could provide a overview of saying why you believe the resulted analysis result at a big picture, in the big picture, will be comparable, that will be sufficient, and really appreciate it.
So we will do our best to accommodate that request, because I think it's reasonable, and we, I guess, tried to smooth it over here, but I think it's reasonable to ask for, evidence of that, depending on timing, because coming up with those examples and the integer relaxation method, the math behind that is more intense, sadly, than the modified offer curve. So that was another factor into the decision not to go into detail in this workshop, because
that's fair.
We would have needed another 3 hours. But we'll take that request and figure out the best way to explain that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, JK. Let's go to Alva.
Hello. I also want to push against the whole thing JK was arguing for, because I think one of the subtleties here is the selection of the integer variables that you include in what you're calling the equivalent problem, and all of the integer variables in the unit commitment problem interact in potentially subtle ways. So it's going to be highly dependent on which integer variables you include in that relaxation versus which you don't. And presumably you're not going to include all the integer variables in the unit commitment in this approach to pricing, or you're gonna have like long start effects on pricing that you have not been included in this discussion so far. But I will look forward to seeing what you provide on that. I wanted to just basically offer 4 challenges to you that I see as problems with this approach, and I think you can probably answer them, but I just want to like offer these as things that I see as problems with going to fast start pricing. One is, can you demonstrate that there are incentives for resources to bid their true costs under these approaches, or are there incentives to bid strategically, potentially to undercut their true costs because of what they're seeing in terms of how the pricing is done? A second is, does this create, particularly if you incorporate fast start pricing in the day-ahead market, does this create an incentive for load serving entities to basically attempt to create solutions that avoid starts in the day-ahead market? And by essentially being less willing to procure load in the day-ahead market. A third is, does this approach to pricing energy lead to a degradation of the usefulness of the other components of your price signals? And in other words, do these fast start components overwhelm congestion components or loss components or GHG components in a way that is not constructive for the use of prices in this market? And the last is, can you really distinguish between decisions that are being made by the CAISO for operational reasons versus decisions that are being made in the market in each of these successive markets? Because if CAISO decisions are driving these prices, then that seems problematic to the purpose of this approach to pricing. So those are challenges, and I think you can probably address them, but I'd like to, and I'm not asking you to address them on the spot by any means. I just would like to have those thought about in proceeding in this direction.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. I think those are all reasonable things to think about when we're thinking about fast start pricing in terms of the policy. I'll just stop on the last comment, because fast start pricing would only apply under conditions and with which the market commits a resource, and not with which the CAISO manually commits a resource. And so, we showed in that there are certain constraints that the CAISO has, like the specific constraint is escaping me, but in the December 12th analysis, there's some discussion about, having some sort of minimum generation in a local area, sort of a reliability constraint that's not, the market. Yeah. So the unit is committed in order to satisfy certain constraints, and not necessarily because it's fully economic. So you would hope to have fast start pricing logic that's applying only in cases with which it's truly the economic decision with the market's making to commit a fast start unit to serve load, that you would apply the fast start logic to.
Yeah, that's the objective. I understand,
yeah.
but it may not be possible to disentangle those in the actual market, particularly with things like the nomograms. Those are running in concert with everything else. So.
Yeah, and in terms of the unit commitment variables, again, I have to give this disclaimer that I am talking about a high level approach here, in the way that PJM and MISO are going to do it. And when you get down into the nitty gritty, I'm sure my conclusion that you're going to get the exact same prices is probably going to break down the further and further you look. But this is in context of the analysis. If you look through the PJM report, or that we linked, they do a pretty good job of walking you through specifically what constraints within the overall optimization problem are being relaxed, and how those constraints, they have a 3-bus example that they use to show how those constraints change the pricing LMPs at each node relative to the scheduling run. And so that's a really good place to start thinking about this, and then we can sort of build on top of there. So I do really recommend that report.
For the homework.
Yep, homework, everybody. All right, let's go to Callie.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. First of all, I'll echo JK. Really appreciate you guys walking through all the different options here. And I know the policy discussion is scoped out for, I think, the next track of this of price formation effort in general. But I think one thing that would be useful in the analysis, to the extent it's not already included, that will help with that conversation, especially since all three of these options seem to have trade-offs, right? There's different approaches, there's different variations, there's different trade-offs between them. And it all kind of ties back to what is the original problem we're trying to address. So I think something in the analysis phase that would help at least gather data when we get to that point in the conversation is, to the extent these fast start resources where are they being dispatched to in their operating range? Because a lot of these options, the impact they will have on the actual price formation and the resulting prices really does depend on, are they primarily being dispatched down to PMIN or in their lower operating range or in their upper operating range. So, my ask is, I guess, to the extent it's not already included in the analysis, and I apologize if it is. It's been a couple, I think, working groups since we've talked fast start pricing. If you guys can show some analysis that breaks down the dispatch of these resources, excuse me, by operating range, and especially kind of the BCR numbers too. Our BCR, is big cost recovery mostly for resources that are dispatched at PMAX, PMIN, or is it kind of all along the range there? I think would be really useful.
Okay, so that's an interesting comment, because I think we are planning to have more metrics as it relates to cost recovery. And you're saying another interesting variance on, variance on cost recovery would also include, like, how does the cost recovery vary by where the resources are being dispatched, whether, between PMIN and PMAX, right?
Yeah, I think so, because I think the most extreme cases that maybe it was variant 1 versus variant 3, or even a couple of variants of variant 1, where you're dividing by PMAX versus dividing by PMIN. Obviously, that will have different adjusted curves and will impact the prices differently depending on if they're operating at PMAX or down at PMIN in terms of cost recovery as well. Are they recovering more than their actual costs or less than their actual cost, depending on where they're being dispatched to? Obviously, within that conversation, we'll have to have how big of a problem, how big of an issue is it in general, but setting that aside, I think having that metric or some additional metrics looking at where they're being dispatched in their operating range would be really useful and help with those trade-off conversations.
Yeah, I can see that. I understand the ask, and I think that that would be reasonable. We can take that back.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I really appreciate everybody's participation today. Hopefully this was effective in terms of getting walking through the amortization methods slower and getting people a chance to ask these questions will help folks better digest the draft analysis that was posted in December, but also can better engage on the upcoming analysis that we're planning to publish sometime in March. And if it looks like there's no other questions in the queue, so I'm gonna, I'll just quickly, thanks Mike for your color commentary and appreciate your help on all this today. And I'll pass it over to Brenda to close us out.
Thank you, James. Okay, everyone, just double checking my audio is working. Okay. And that producer can confirm, can you hear me? Okay, so for this call, thank you. Yeah, for this call, we will have this recording hopefully expedited to get the recording posted to everyone within the week. We also plan to have an upcoming meeting series with a schedule that has been updated here on your link on your page. So we do have some March dates and also some April dates that we're looking to focusing on. We are aware that March will be a busier month for most of the working groups that we have currently. So keep an eye out for that. As well, we do have the upcoming market performance and planning forum coming up in March. That date may move depending on other working groups that are happening. So just letting everyone give a heads up on that. So we do have our upcoming deadline for the annual policy initiatives roadmap process for 2024. This is a reminder to all stakeholders. We welcome all submissions to submit potential discretionary initiatives to the 2024 annual policy catalog. We did have this meeting a few weeks ago on the 30th to discuss that, and that recording and presentation is posted under the annual policy initiatives process roadmap and catalog. And so we do have that common template, and everyone's available to submit as many entries as you like on that common template. You will have to just make sure you identify the correct title per entry. So you could submit up to 4 or 5 entries per organization. And then if you have any more questions, the person that will have the lead on this is Jillian Bellinger. You can email us at ISO Stakeholder Affairs, but feel free. We'll be sending out a notice tomorrow as a reminder for folks to kind of get an idea where that common template is located. We do have our upcoming Stakeholder Symposium coming this year on 2024. It will be held on October 30th. So it will be 1 day versus the 2 days that we've done in the past. But we do have a welcome reception as optional, and that will be a reception the 29th. It will be located at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center, the actual symposium, but the reception will be held at a different location. We'll have that announced pretty soon. Right now, we don't have a registration date of what date we're going to ask for registration, but we will send out that information soon on our notice. But please be sure to save the date if you plan on coming. And we also just have this quick screen. We're very excited to kind of kick things off this year. So it'll be a 1 day, but be sure if you could come on the 29th, that'll be great, just to kind of meet more people from our stakeholder community. But with that, I don't have any other announcements for this call, but I did send out the attendance link earlier on your chat. Feel free to see that. We do have links on this PowerPoint. So once you do download that PDF, you'll see all those links be hyperlinked to different places across the CAISO website, either as a reference or materials. And then with that, we also have a reminder that the last working group common deadline is coming up on the 20th, I believe. So make sure to keep out on that for Sprint 3. So submit those common templates for that specific working group session. And then we do have, like I said, the schedule up to date for now, but we'll keep an eye out to make sure we don't overlap or have too much congestion of different meetings happening in 1 week. So our stakeholder affairs group is working diligently to help make sure working groups and meetings and forums are at a good, reasonable time for our stakeholders. And we are aware of other external conferences, so we are keeping an eye out for those meetings that are happening outside the ISO, just to make sure we don't overlap. So with that, let's go ahead and conclude our call. And thanks so much, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you at our next stakeholder meeting or working group session. All right, can you go ahead and close our meeting, please? Ahmed?